All right, in this video, we're dedicating it to a villain's recipe, and it's from the Evil Queen, and it's called golden squash and apple soup. So I'll show you just a picture of it there. So basically, this is a butternut squash and apple soup with a few other ingredients that we're going to cook on the stovetop together, blend together, and then enjoy.
All right, so here as I drop my pre-diced onion, celery, and carrots, I'm adding into the pot where I'd melted some butter, and I'm going to let them cook for about 8 minutes. Okay, now I'm adding in some spices and seasonings. I've already added in some garlic, and now I'm adding in some ginger, and I've got a few other things to add like salt and pepper, and I'll let that simmer for about a minute or two. Now that the spices are all blended in and simmering, it's time to add the apples, followed by the butternut squash. And now I'm going to add the chicken broth. I'm going to give it a good swirl, and then I need to let the soup come to a boil and then let it simmer for about 12 minutes or until the vegetables are soft. Now that it's all cooked, it's time to put everything into the blender, and I'm going to blend it all together until it's nice and creamy. And there you go, you can see it starting to blend together. And I had to do it in a couple batches. The soup back in the pot, blended and ready to eat.
All right, so that was the soup. It was actually really delicious. I really enjoyed it. I really like a good butternut squash soup. I go crazy in the fall when Panera releases that autumn squash soup or whatever they have. But I will say, I think it's a little sweet sometimes. I think I looked at their sugar content one time and it's a little high. So this I liked because it was definitely a healthier version. Didn't have any sugar or anything into it. But I will say it had a little bit of a kick to it. There is cumin and black pepper that went inside this soup, so it did add a little bit of spice. So I wanted you to keep that in mind if you're making this soup and you've got little ones you want to share it with. Those may be 2 ingredients that you want to omit for it. I also mentioned it doesn't say what kind of apples to use for this, and I used Granny Smith. Granny Smith does tend to be a little bit more on the tart side, so that could be why, those spices, if I would have used a sweeter apple, who knows, maybe it would have offset those spices a little bit more. I guess we'll see if we find out. So anyway, let's get into my rankings on everything. And the first is the ingredients on a scale of 1 to 5, and that's in terms of how difficult they are to find and cost. I'm going to give it a 2, and the only reason I'm going to give it a 2 is because of the butternut squash. Now, as you saw in the video, I used pre-cut butternut squash. I loved it at the store. They already had the made packs. I just grabbed 2 of them and threw it right in my soup. Didn't have to cut anything. But I don't know, depending on where you live, that might not be easily for you to find in your grocery store. And, sometimes finding butternut squash certain times of the year is easier said than done than others. So that's the only reason I'm giving it a 2 is it could just depend on where you live and how the availability of butternut squash to you on that. Difficulty level on a scale of 1 to 5, and I'm going to give it 2, which means it's definitely on the easy side. It could probably be like 1.5. Again, the only reason I'm giving it a little bit above a 1 is, there's a few things you have to dice and stuff like that. But again, that butternut squash, I bought that pre-made stuff that was diced. So easy peasy, simple. To me, this was like kind of a 1. But, if you have a squash, I don't know, I've never enjoyed dicing a butternut squash on my own. I've done them before. I'm not a big fan of it. Maybe I just need more practice. And the second part of that too, I had to think about the difficulty is you have to blend everything in a blender. Now that's not hard. I used to be petrified of putting soups in blenders and blending them, or I didn't say petrified, I just didn't like doing it. I think honestly it's probably because it just dirties another dish and you can't throw the blender in the dishwasher, so you have to kind of hand wash that part. I do still spill a little bit on the counter, but I've been careful. I use the gloves to make sure that way I don't accidentally burn myself pouring anything in, and try to pour in carefully. Sometimes I use a spoon or a ladle to put it into the blender to do that. So it's still fairly of a simple recipe, but it's a little more complicated than some other things. That's why I think a 2 is a fair rating. And then finally, would I make this again on a scale of 1 to 5, and 5 being absolutely, it's a 5. And as I said, I kind of want to experiment a little bit maybe with the apples and the flavors and stuff like that. I personally love the spice that the cumin and the pepper brought to it. And so that's why I will continue to do it, but I still think that might be a warning. And, Panera, I do love your autumn squash soup, but, this made a lot of soup for a pretty reasonable price. It definitely was a lot healthier. So I definitely will be making this again. It's a 5 for me. And if you like butternut squash soup, I think it's definitely one that you should consider making this recipe because it's not really that difficult and it makes a good soup.